From the newsrooms of the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, this is Please Explain. I'm Samantha Selinger-Morris. It's Monday, January 22nd. When Pope Francis remarked in a landmark speech earlier this month that surrogate motherhood was a despicable practice that should be universally banned, for some it signaled a backward step for the Catholic Church. Because only weeks earlier, the global religious leader had allowed same-sex couples to finally receive the blessings of a priest. But before we write off the Pope's most recent comments, we have to ask ourselves, does he have a point? Today, surrogate and surrogacy lawyer Sarah Jefford on the ethical minefields and joys inherent to surrogacy. But first, former religion editor and Center for Public Christianity's Barney Zwartz on what we should know about the Pope's statement. So Barney, for many of us, the Pope's comments seem to come out of nowhere. Can you help us understand in what context did he make these comments and why?
Well, he made the comments at the State of the World address to diplomats at the Vatican, which is about 184 countries. It's certainly one of the most important speeches the Pope gives all year.
The unborn child in the mother's womb cannot be suppressed or turned into an object of trafficking. Therefore, the practice of what's known as surrogate motherhood is deplorable.
It is deeply considered. He would have thought about it for a long time. He would have, I'm sure, had several drafts of the speech, and there will be nothing accidental in it.
A child is always a gift, and never the basis of a commercial contract.
There were two themes that were particularly prominent. One was the use of civilians as collateral damage in war, such as we're seeing in Gaza and Ukraine, and the second was surrogacy. And the link that shows the context is the Pope's particular concern for the vulnerable and exploited and the weak and the defenseless, especially for those who are at danger of becoming commodities, and that is definitely the fear with surrogacy. So that's the context for the Pope's remark. So for him, these are issues of human dignity. I think that's the general context. It comes from the Church's emphasis on natural law, so that the Church is always unhappy about intervention. And this starts with contraception, as you know, but also applies to IVF and especially to abortion. The Church is deeply traditional. Rome semper idem is one of the Church's mottos, which just means we never change, we're always the same. This is not quite true. For example, they've totally reversed their position on capital punishment, but basically it believes that its social teaching on the natural law has served the Church and its people well, and it doesn't believe that it should fluctuate in response to the winds of cultural change in the West.
It's so interesting what you say there about the motto being "we never change," because it was only recently that the Vatican allowed same-sex unions to be blessed. So
yes.
Do these remarks from the Pope about surrogacy perhaps represent the Church taking a step backwards in terms of being socially progressive?
That's a really good question. They still think that same-sex marriage is against God's will and against God's law, but the Pope has quite a pastoral heart, more so I think than his predecessors. He famously said, "Who am I to judge about gay people?" not long after he was elected. He's trying to affirm what is really and truly good in these unions. He recognises that gay people love each other like anybody else, and he wants not to stand in their way in a pastoral sense, but the Church is still quite absolutely firm that same-sex marriage is a no-no. So one of the problems for people in the West is they forget the Pope of the whole Catholic world. That's 1.2 billion people, and the vast majority of them are not in the West, and they do not share all the West's concerns and values and desire for change in particular social areas. So he has to tread very carefully whatever his own thinking is.
Okay, and it's interesting what you were saying there with regards to what the Vatican did and did not say about same-sex couples. And the Church made clear that a blessing of a same-sex couple wasn't the same as a marriage sacrament. So given all of this, how is the Pope viewed within the Church? I mean, is he seen as progressive despite his view on surrogacy?
He's progressive by Catholic standards, but not by ordinary Western people in the pews. He's widely disliked on both sides. Well, he's more than disliked, he's loathed by some of the conservatives, some of the Catholics in America. They think he's a dangerous radical. And as I also said, the people on the progressive side feel that he's not gone far enough. I think that he has been a bit weak on clergy sexual abuse. It took him quite a few years of this papacy to really understand the extent and evil of it. Again, he's an Argentinian who's 87, grew up in the church, he grew up as a Jesuit. And I think it's from his Jesuit background that this particular concern that he has, this particular identification with the vulnerable particularly comes out. And that gives rise to a lot of the good things about him, a lot of his unwillingness to judge, a lot of his openness to people where they are, even though his doctrines, his upholding the magisterium, is reasonably intact.
Thank you so much, Barney, for your time.
It'd be my pleasure.
After the break, surrogate and surrogacy lawyer Sarah Jefford chats about the joys and ethical minefields inherent to surrogacy. Sarah, thank you for joining us on Please Explain. Now, you've been a surrogate and you also provide legal services to couples who are interested in pursuing surrogacy. But does the Pope perhaps have a point?
Yeah, absolutely. I think when he talks about exploitation or violation, I think there are some valid concerns there, particularly when we do surrogacy outside of Australia. We've seen a number of examples in other countries where surrogacy has been exploitative, and we have seen women and children at risk, particularly if it's not regulated. Late in 2023, there was a police raid in the Mediterranean fertility clinic in Crete, where quite a number of Australians had engaged to do surrogacy.
On the surface, the Mediterranean Fertility Institute is a world leader in helping desperate couples have a baby. But it's now alleged it's a corrupt and criminal enterprise that exploits that desperation for greed.
And there were question marks around the genetics of children conceived and born from that clinic.
Police are investigating whether some of the babies were conceived with sham embryos using eggs or sperm from strangers.
And also whether or not even surrogates were not surrogates at all, that in fact they had been pregnant before they had been recruited by the clinic. So they were handing over their own conceived child, which raises allegations of human trafficking.
Refugee women brought into the country, put in safe houses and forced to be surrogates. Also claims of illegal adoptions and fraud.
The whole situation in Crete, unfortunately for me, is disappointing, but it's never surprising when we engage in international surrogacy and when it is not properly regulated. And I think it raises real concerns for intended parents who are hoping to have a child with their own genetics, only to discover that actually what they've been told and what they've paid for, essentially, is not the true situation in the clinic or in the country where they've gone to.
Okay, and there's other ethical minefields, though, I understand that you've actually encountered when you're helping people here who want to become parents and they're exploring surrogacy. So can you take us through some of those?
Yeah, so surrogacy in Australia is fairly well regulated, but it's also a little bit complex because we do have different laws for each state. And I do speak to intended parents and surrogates that have the very best of intentions but may not be very informed about what the laws mean for surrogacy. So when we do surrogacy, we are intending to conceive and carry a child, knowing that the child is going to be relinquished to the intended parents. And that raises some complexities around our ideas of parentage, around the legalities, but also about what's in the best interests of a child that is not yet even conceived. So there's often ethical discussions around the autonomy of the surrogate and decision-making for her during pregnancy and the birth, and also about what's best for the child in those circumstances. I have clients that will ask me all sorts of interesting questions like, what if we have twins and the surrogate keeps one and we keep one? That sounds like a great idea. And we have to talk about the ethics of actually you splitting twins, but also that's not allowed under Australian law. If there are multiple births, then the children must stay together. So we have those discussions every day in surrogacy in Australia, but luckily we have a framework that I think provides us with an ethical framework for surrogacy within Australia.
And this sort of reminds me, and I'm sure a lot of listeners, of a very famous and unfortunate case of surrogacy, the case of baby Gammy, where that child was rejected after the child was born. So can you remind us of that case and whether you actually still see cases like it?
Yeah, so the baby Gammy case is quite sad. It happened in Thailand. It was an Australian couple, intended parents, who engaged with a surrogate in Thailand to carry their babies. And she was pregnant with twins, a boy and a girl. And one baby, the little boy, had Down syndrome, and the little girl did not have Down syndrome, was otherwise healthy. And the intended parents decided that they would take custody of the little girl, but they would not take custody of the little boy. And what occurred then is that the surrogate is essentially raising this little boy.
7-month-old baby Gammy has become the innocent face of the dark side of commercial surrogacy, of what can happen when couples don't get the baby they ordered.
And it hit the headlines, of course, because that really does raise ethical questions for Australians. Why are we doing surrogacy in another country where we're essentially exploiting other women, and in this case, perhaps seeing that child as a commodity that we can decide whether or not we'll take custody or not? And also, what's in the best interest of those two children, that should they be raised together, and how is it that they've decided to take one and abandon the other? So in Australia, potentially that could happen. By law, we're not meant to split twins, as I mentioned, but that doesn't mean we don't have questions for surrogacy arrangements about, well, what if the baby is born with a disability? And what if the intended parents change their mind? So much of surrogacy in Australia doesn't really fit around the law, it fits around the relationships and the trust between the parties, so that they're not always questioning whether this situation will occur, and knowing that there's a backup plan, for example, if people do change their mind, or if a situation occurs where, for example, intended parents were to die before the baby was born. Who's going to care for that baby? Let's talk about that. Rather than leaving it to chance, we'll actually have a plan B so that we can feel some assurance that there is a plan for this baby.
Okay, so maybe you can take us through that a bit. What are the laws surrounding surrogacy in Australia?
So we have individual laws in each state and territory, and most of them have the same fundamental principles. The first one is that the intended parents must qualify for surrogacy, and that means that they can't carry, or if they are to try and carry, it's risky for the mother or for the baby. So they have to have what's called a medical or a social reason. That means that a gay couple can do surrogacy, or an infertile heterosexual couple can do surrogacy, but they must have that criteria before they proceed. We don't have the sort of too posh to push situation in Australia. There has to be a reason for surrogacy. When the baby's born, the surrogate and her partner are registered as the child's parents on the original birth registration. So the first birth certificate for this child lists the surrogate and her partner as the parents. So that's the process kind of in a nutshell. And that's a fairly good legal framework. I think we've got some work to do to make it more easier for intended parents to do it in Australia so that they're not compelled to go overseas.
Okay, and I wanted to ask you a bit more about what the Pope said. He said he hoped that the international community would prohibit surrogacy universally. But you've been a surrogate, you as a lawyer have worked with parents in this area. What do you think?
I just don't think prohibition is the answer for anything of this sort. I don't think it certainly doesn't support the rights of women, and it doesn't support the best interests of children, because when we prohibit a practice like surrogacy, it really just drives it underground further. We've seen in countries where it's not well regulated, or where there's been bans in place, the people that suffer the most are the surrogates, the women that are carrying babies. And we worry about these children who may end up stateless or uncared for or given up to orphanages. So prohibition is definitely not the answer. What I think for Australia, for our Australian decision makers to consider, is why is it that it is more compelling and more viable for Australian intended parents to travel overseas for surrogacy than to do it in our own country where it is regulated. Our system allows for altruistic surrogacy only, so a surrogate is not paid for being a surrogate in Australia, which means not many women want to do it. There's only about 115 surrogacy births in Australia each year, and there's over 200 babies born overseas for Australian intended parents. So if we have a conversation about what are the ways that we can make it more viable here for women to put themselves forward and for intended parents to see it as a viable option, then I think actually the Australian government has a responsibility to do that, to stop people from feeling like they need to go somewhere else.
Okay, and so you've taken us through how prohibiting surrogacy, as the Pope is advocating for, could be very problematic. It could actually make the situation less safe for surrogates and children, as I understand it. But I'd love to ask you about the other side of the coin, which is that surrogacy, as I understand has been your experience, can actually be a joyful experience, a wonderful gift.
Absolutely. It's one of the best things I've ever done. I felt very empowered and informed about my rights. The intended parents were as well. They knew that I had full autonomy to make final decisions during pregnancy and birth, but we also had such a good relationship that we could reach agreements together. The moment of seeing them become parents was one of the best experiences of my life, because It also felt very natural that handing her over was the best thing, because that's how she was intended. She was conceived with the intention that she would be their child, and to see that fulfilled and to see them caring for her was just a dream come true for me. And most surrogates will say that. They feel like holding the baby and caring for the baby feels unnatural, because actually that's not what they'd hoped for at all. And we also work on and have a really good relationship between my family and the intended parents and their child. We spend birthdays together and Christmas together. We go on holidays. I've babysat for her. But that is something that you have to work at, just like any relationship. It doesn't just come easy for everybody. There is a little bit of mind gymnastics that we do as surrogates to kind of think through, well, I know how much I love being pregnant and giving birth, but could I actually give away a baby? And there is a difference in carrying my own children and carrying this little one, in that I never intended to give away my children, but I had intended for this little one to go home with her parents, with her dads. So that felt very natural, and in fact in some ways kind of confusing in how simple it was. That I remember in the days after she was born thinking, this is amazing, I'm so happy, and maybe I'm waiting for the moment where I feel like I should grieve this child. And I never felt any sadness or grief. I knew where she was. I hadn't lost her. She was exactly where I wanted her to be.
Sarah, thank you so much for joining us and taking us through this.
Thank you for having me.
Today's episode of Please Explain was produced by Tammy Mills. Our executive producer is Ruby Schwartz. Please Explain is a production of The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. If you enjoy the show and want more of our journalism, subscribe to our newspapers today. It's the best way to support what we do. Search The Age or smh.com.au/subscribe. I'm Samantha Selinger-Morris. This is Please Explain. Thanks for listening.